the Whispering Woods. The small town of Pine Hollow had always been a place of mystery. Nestled at the edge of an ancient forest, it was a place where people spoke in hushed tones about things best left unmentioned. The townsfolk avoided the forest, especially after dark, and passed down tales of strange occurrences that had plagued the area for centuries. Lena was a newcomer, having recently moved to Pine Hollow to escape the chaos of the city. She loved the quiet, the solitude, and the thick canopy of trees that surrounded the town. The forest, with its towering pines and dense underbrush, called to her, offering a sense of peace she had longed for. But the warnings from the locals didn't sit well with her. How could a forest, so beautiful and serene, be a source of fear? One late afternoon, despite the numerous cautions she had received, Lena decided to venture into the forest. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. As she walked deeper into the woods, she marveled at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, creating a kaleidoscope of light and shadow on the forest floor. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirping of birds. Lena felt a sense of calm wash over her as she walked further, the worries of her past life fading away with each step. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere began to change. The birds grew silent, and the forest, which had seemed so welcoming moments before, took on an ominous tone. The trees, once majestic and comforting, now loomed over her like silent sentinels. A strange fog began to roll in, curling around the trees and creeping along the ground. Lena suddenly felt very alone. She glanced at her watch and realized that she had been walking for hours. The path she had been following had somehow disappeared, and she found herself surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. Panic began to set in as she tried to retrace her steps, but every direction looked the same. And then she heard it. A whisper, soft and faint, carried by the breeze. Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but the whispering stopped. She told herself it was just the wind, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The whispering started again, louder this time, as if voices were coming from all around her. Lena's breath quickened. The words were unintelligible, a cacophony of overlapping voices that seemed to be coming from the very trees themselves. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Lena's fear was now palpable. She turned in circles, trying to find the source of the voices, but there was nothing but trees and fog. Without warning, something darted between the trees ahead of her, a shadowy figure that moved too quickly for her to see clearly. Lena's heart leapt into her throat as she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence and the thickening fog that seemed to close in around her. Desperately, Lena began to run, crashing through the underbrush, branches scratching at her arms and face. She had to find a way out, had to get back to the town. But no matter which direction she ran, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees twisting and contorting as if mocking her desperation. The whispering returned, now louder and more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was alive, the voices calling to her, beckoning her deeper into its dark embrace. Lena's panic turned to terror as she realized she was not alone in these woods. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the fog, just ahead of her. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow, dressed in tattered clothing that clung to her skeletal frame. Lena skidded to a halt, her breath catching in her throat. The woman raised a bony hand and pointed at Lena, her mouth moving soundlessly. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if urging Lena to move closer. Terrified, Lena took a step back, but the ground beneath her gave way, and she tumbled down a steep embankment, landing hard on the forest floor. Pain shot through her leg, and she cried out, struggling to stand. The fog swirled around her, thicker than ever, and the whispering voices seemed to be all around her, pressing in on her mind. She couldn't think, couldn't focus. The terror was overwhelming, and she realized with dawning horror that she might never leave this forest. Then, through the fog, she saw a light, a faint, flickering glow in the distance. Hope surged within her as she limped toward it, her breaths ragged and shallow. The light grew brighter, and she soon realized it was a lantern, swinging gently in the hand of a tall, hooded figure. "Help!" Lena called out, her voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. "Please, help me." The figure turned slowly, and as Lena drew closer, she saw the glint of something metallic in the figure's other hand. A long, curved blade. She stopped in her tracks, her heart hammering in her chest. The hooded figure stood motionless, the lantern casting eerie shadows on the ground. Lena's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body was frozen with fear. The figure took a step forward, and the whispering voices rose to a deafening pitch, drowning out her thoughts. Just as the figure raised the blade, Lena's vision blurred, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was the sound of her own scream, mingling with the whispers of the forest. When Lena awoke, she was lying on the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. She was cold, bruised, and disoriented, but alive. The fog had lifted, and the forest now seemed ordinary, the sinister atmosphere of the night before gone. Lena struggled to her feet, her leg throbbing with pain. She could still hear faint whispers in the back of her mind, a lingering echo of the terror she had experienced. Shaking, she limped back to Pine Hollow, vowing never to return to the forest again. But as she reached the safety of her home, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had let her go. Not out of mercy, but for some other darker reason. The whispers would return, she was sure of it. And next time, she might not be so lucky.